Excellencies, members of the Club of Rome, ladies and gentlemen.
35 years ago, the Club of Rome warned about the environmental dangers of unlimited economic growth. 3 decades on, the planet is showing signs of strain. And even the most skeptical of leaders from around the world is attending the climate summit in Copenhagen to hash out a new global treaty on climate change. Nevertheless, Martin Lees, the Secretary General of the Club of Rome, is worried the urgency of combating climate change may not translate into real political action.
The knowledge on the scientific side, the evidence, the historic records, all of that is clear, but not much of that gets into the political process. And that is the great danger. The scientists can see this coming, but the political process has not yet adapted to take full account of the scale of the threats that we face.
A political process that will largely depend on the political will of big polluters like the United States and China to limit their greenhouse gas emissions. As the biggest emitter of CO2, China is often accused of doing too little to combat climate change.
The biggest misconception about China's position on climate change is that it isn't doing anything. In fact, China is doing a lot, and part of China's frustration is that nobody wants to listen to all the things that it's been trying to do for the last 5 years.
But Christine Lo, a Chinese environmentalist, says the Chinese government is only too aware of the threats it faces.
If we look at the changing in temperatures, if we look at the fast melting of the mountain glaciers in the Himalayas, this is going to already shift the pattern of agriculture. So we don't just see it as a global problem, it's actually a big problem for us domestically. There's enough research to show the leaders that actually this is something they need to pay a lot of attention to.
Nevertheless, when it comes to fighting climate change, China, alongside other developing countries, accuses the West of making the mess.
The Chinese and the Indians quite correctly say several things which we all know. The first is that the Western governments have been pumping emissions into the atmosphere since, let us say, 1750. They've paid no cost. They have grown very fast and everybody is well off because of that. And now that the Chinese and Indians wish to bring their living standards up, we're telling them they can't do it because they shouldn't pump emissions into the atmosphere, even though they're doing much, much less than us. So that is, in terms of ethics and equity and politics, a very difficult thing to do.
China feels it's being demonized, China feels that people are being unfair to it, and then I think deep in the Chinese psyche, is it that the West doesn't really want China to develop?
That's why China has made it clear that reducing CO2 emissions will damage its economic growth and development. Instead, it demands money from the developed world to help them transit into a green economy.
China always stated clearly that developing countries will do their action based on the condition that developed countries first implement their commitment, including the condition on the financial support and the technical transfer to support developing countries. So without that commitment first, developing country will not accept any obligatory target for the CO2 emission reduction. But that not means China and other developing countries doing nothing.
But as world leaders struggle to hash out a new global climate deal in Copenhagen aiming to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they may be facing a hurdle even more formidable: how to raise enough money to actually implement a deal.
The impact of the financial crisis and what are called fiscal recovery packages is that governments have increased their levels of debt spectacularly in a short time. And they all feel that with their budget deficits running at the levels they are, they're not going to be able to find much money for anything, however important it may be. So the prospects of raising significant funds for the kind of activities you need to deal with climate change have taken a hit. But as I said to you, if you consider that you've spent trillions to clear up a relatively temporary financial crisis, you ought at least to be prepared to spend a few billion to solve what is an existential threat to the whole of humanity.